Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be crocheting this easy homemaker throw. It just uses one stitch and I'm going to show you everything you need to know start to finish to make this knit look gingham blanket. It's really simple and really fun to make. I'm going to be using Lion Brand yarn, Touch of Alpaca. These are the bonus bundles. Right now, these are exclusively available through lionbrand.com and also at Michael's stores. So you're going to need 4 bonus bundles, each of the cream color and the blush color. Now you can use any cream or white worsted weight yarn and a saturated colored yarn. It can be pastel, it can be dark, and you can use the same technique to get a gingham look. I do recommend, though, before picking your yarn, you watch this video all the way through just to see how I go about creating the color tones that you need for that gingham kind of look. So I do recommend just watching everything first before picking your yarns, just so that you know what you're in for and you know what you have to do to create this look. So here I have my Touch of Alpaca. Again, these are the 200-gram balls. They do sell this yarn in 100-gram balls, and you can use those. They'll work just fine. You just need twice as many. So altogether, you're going to need 8 balls of yarn, 4 cream, 4 blush. I'm also going to be using an L or 8mm crochet hook. So this is the yarn. I chose to go with blush, and with the way that I mix the colors and that you'll see very soon, I blend the blush and the cream together, and it creates a really nice subtle gingham look. If you used a darker color, it's going to create a darker look. Again, you can use any worsted weight yarn, any category 4 weight yarn with your 8mm hook, and that should work just fine. So I'm going to start here with 1 ball of blush and 1 ball of cream, and for the entirety of this project I'm going to hold together 2 strands of yarn. Now for this part getting started, I'll be working with a strand of each color. On other parts of the blanket we're going to be working with 2 of the same color, but for right now start with a cream and a blush or whatever your color combination is. Now, before we get going, I want to talk a little bit about the construction of this blanket. So instead of with a traditional blanket, how you would work in rows all the way across the body of the blanket, we're going to be making a series of long, skinny strips. So I have a graphic here of what your finished blanket kind of will look like with these lighter and darker gray squares. So we have white squares, we have light gray squares, and we have dark gray squares. Now we're going to be making 3 each of what I'm going to call our light strip and our dark strip. Our light strip will alternate from blocks of cream and our mix, blush and cream held together, and then our dark strip will alternate between blush only and our mix, blush and cream held together. Now this will make a little bit more sense as you see me get started here, but if you want to also check out the blog post at the link in the description box, that will help you some too. But as we get going, just keep in mind that we're going to be making really long, skinny strips of crochet in our rib stitch, and then we're going to be making 3 of the light color and 3 of the dark color. So if you're completely confused, just stick with me here a little bit. We're going to go ahead and get started on our first strip, again with our mix, 1 strand of blush, 1 strand of cream, and we're going to start with just a normal foundation chain. We're just going to learn the rib stitch, the knit looking rib stitch that we'll be using for this entire pattern, yes, even including the border. So the way we're going to start this is we're going to chain 20. So chain 20 stitches. You can adjust this chain length if you want to. By adjusting it, it's going to make your squares and your strips, by extension, either larger or smaller width-wise. So here I have my chain of 20. Nice and loose chain. We don't want any curling. So skip the first 2 stitches, and then in that 3rd stitch, we're going to make our special stitch. So it's a yarn over, insert your hook in the loop, pull up a stitch. We have 3 loops on our hook, and you're not going to yarn over as you would with a normal half double crochet. Do not yarn over, just go ahead and slip stitch, so just pull through those 2 stitches on the hook. I'll do that again so you can watch it. Next stitch, yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop. We now have 3 loops on our hook. Do not yarn over. Just go ahead and pull through 2 loops to slip stitch. Now, this is called a back loop only half double crochet slip stitch. Try saying that 5 times fast. yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, and pull through 2. So essentially you're working sort of a half double crochet, but you're not yarning over, you're slip stitching to finish it. And you'll see where the back loop only part comes in just a moment. It's a little bit confusing, but once you do it a couple of times, it becomes really easy. So just work these first few rows with me here, and I promise it'll get a lot easier really, really fast. Also, with this pattern, we're going to be working this exact stitch, our back loop only half double crochet slip stitch, for the entirety of the pattern. All of your strips, every single row, even the border, are all going to be worked with this stitch. You could easily make this whole blanket in regular half double crochet and don't worry about the back loop, don't worry about the slip stitch situation. It just won't have that nice like rib, knitted rib looking kind of texture to it. But if that's your jam and you just want an easy gingham blanket and you don't want to do any special, fluffy stitches, you don't have to. You can work this whole concept in just regular half double crochet if that's what you want. I personally love the knit looking stitch. I initially wanted to knit this blanket instead of crochet, but crochet is just faster, and with a big throw blanket like this, it was really necessary to just go ahead and crochet it. So here I am at the end of my row. I've done my half double crochet slip stitches all the way across, still holding together both strands of yarn as if they were one, and you can see that this is starting to create kind of like a marled marble kind of look, which I really, really like. It kind of lightens up that blush tone and makes it more subtle and more just kind of different. You don't usually see a lot of yarns that have such variation in color in them. So here's row 1 all done. What we're going to do is we're going to chain 2 and turn. The end of every single row, we're always going to chain 2 and turn. So here's our chain 2, we're going to turn it, and now we're going to work our back loop only half double crochet slip stitch. So basically we're going to do the same thing we did, but looking at this stitch, if you look at the top of it, we have our 2 V's, just like we do with all crochet stitches, and you'll also notice that half double crochets have a bit of a kind of loop or stitch looking in the front, but we're going to ignore that. We're going to yarn over, insert in the back loop only. Don't go in both loops like this, how we normally would with a half double crochet. Go in the back loop only. Of course, this is working in our cream and our blush loops, because remember, we're holding together 2 stitches or 2 colors of yarn. We now have 3 loops on our hook. After we've pulled up a loop, we're going to just go ahead and pull through 2. So watch that again in the back loop only of this next stitch. We can see it's kind of leaving a little V shape in the front here. And as we work further down this row, you'll see that this type of stitch, by working in the back loop only, will kind of push little V shapes that look kind of like knit stitches to the front, and it'll look almost like knitted ribbing, but we'll get there. Go ahead and work your second stitch, yarn over, insert again in the back loop only. I hope you can see that there. Yarn over, pull up a loop, and just pull through 2. Yarn over, insert your hook in the back loop only, pull up a stitch, and pull through 2. We can see here what it should be looking like. You can kind of see these V's kind of pushing forward in the front. Also, if you're not seeing the V's that I'm talking about, just make sure you're stitching in the back loop. Work up a few rows of this, as I will here in a moment. And after several rows, you'll kind of start to see those V's in the more knit looking ribbing kind of thing here. So just go ahead and keep continuing with this back loop only half double crochet slip stitch. As we've worked up a few more rows, you can see a little bit more what the stitch should be looking like. This also creates a fairly thick fabric, both from holding 2 strands of yarn together and also just that kind of ribbing fabric is a little bit thicker than a normal worsted weight blanket, which I like because it's going to be quite a bit warmer when you use the blanket. So go ahead and work all the way across. In case you're wondering, talking a little bit about the very beginning of this video when I showed you those diagrams, I'm starting on the darker looking strip. So we need 3 each, remember, of the lighter strip and the darker strip. The darker strip is the one that begins with this marled mixed yarn with 1 cream and 1 blush. The lighter strip will begin with just cream or just your light color. So here I've finished the row. I'm going to chain up 2, go ahead and turn. We're going to do the same thing we did. And from here on out, if you've finished row 2, you know how to make this whole blanket. So again, we're going to work in the back loop only, half double crochet slip stitch, just work in that back loop, we yarn over, we insert our hook in the back loop only, we pull up a loop and we pull through 2. This should be getting easy as pie for you guys. If you need to go back to the beginning and watch me make these stitches again, please feel free to do that. That's the wonderful thing about YouTube, is you can pause and rewind until you get it. So you can see here how this should be looking, pushing those V shapes to the front. This is how the back looks. And it should be creating a nice thick fabric that looks kind of knit. So I'm just going to keep working up a bunch of rows. As you can see in the written pattern at the link in the description box below, you're basically just going to keep working on this exact same kind of stitch for each stitch in the row, chain 2 and turn. We're going to keep doing the same thing until you've finished row 18. So keep working in this color until row 18. I'll catch up with you there. And then basically all that's going to happen to work up each of these strips is we're going to change color according to the chart that you saw at the beginning of the video. So basically every so many stitches, you're going to just be creating these different blocks of color that match those diagrams. And if you need to go back to the beginning and look at those diagrams again, or I have them in larger format on the blog post, you can go there too and see the diagrams there. And I explain, all of this same kind of concept in a lot more words over on the blog post as well. So even if you're not familiar with reading patterns, there's not a whole lot to read there. It's just kind of talking you through the concept. So don't be afraid of the written pattern at the blog post at that link. Just give it a go, read up, make sure you're ready to go with this pattern, because being that it is a large blanket, you don't want to trip up at all and your strips not match up and look nice when we go to sew things together. So go ahead and work up through row 18. You're just going to keep repeating this exact same thing. So here I am, I finished row 18. Now, it's kind of hard to count the rows in this particular stitch. What I like to do is count the V kind of shape that looks like the ribbing and then those rows in between. So that's easiest for me to count the rows because it does have such an odd look to it. It doesn't look like normal crochet. So at this point, I'm ready to change color after row 18. For this strip, the darker strip, I'm going to change color to just solid blush. I'm still going to hold together 2 strands of yarn, but I'm going to pull from 2 new skeins of blush just because I want to keep my kind of marled look, my mix block, those skeins separate, because it's easy to get things kind of tangled up if you're using that same skein, large skein of pink, to kind of go back and forth. So just keep 2 skeins for your marled look, that blush and pink mix, or blush and cream mix, and then start with 2 more blush skeins. It'll all work out in the end and you'll have enough yarn. Just go ahead and start with 2 new skeins. I found that that was easier and just less confusing. Personally, it's just how I work though. So after we finish row 18, don't chain up 2 yet. We're going to join our new yarn, 2 strands of blush held together, and that's when we're going to chain up 2. So I just attached my new yarn. I'm chaining up 2. I'm turning. Make sure these tails are kind of pulled down tight so things don't come undone. I'm going to turn my work carefully. I don't want things to get tangled up. Here's my tail. All your tails also should wind up on the same side in this pattern, so make sure that your tails are always on the same side, otherwise you're counting incorrectly. So after I've chained up 2, I've turned, I'm just going to keep working along in this back loop only half double crochet slip stitch that I've been doing, and I'm just going to work in each stitch across. I'm going to chain 2 and turn just like I have been doing, and I'm just going to keep continuing with this. Now I'm on row 19. I'm going to continue until row 33. And then I'm going to change my color back to that marled look. Now for my darker strip, I'm just going to alternate between blocks of solid blush and blocks of the marled mix of blush and cream. So again, just work up to row 33, and then we will just keep continuing alternating with even sized blocks. You're just going to keep repeating that and just work quite a long strip. You're going to finish off your strip when you have 9 total blocks of color. So you should end both with the light strip and the dark strip with a block of color that's the same you started with. So here on the dark strip, I will end my entire strip with a final block of that marled mix, not just the solid blush. So go ahead and just work in each stitch across. I want to work up a couple of rows of this solid blush so you can see what it looks like, and then I'm going to show you how I carry my yarn too, so you don't have too many ends to weave in later. There will still be some ends just because you are alternating colors, but I do carry the yarn to minimize the ends. So you can see here when you change to blush, you can see that's an obvious color change. But because our colored yarn, that blush that I chose, is fairly subtle, it's not like black or a dark saturated color. It's going to be a fairly subtle color change, but when your whole blanket comes together, you'll really be able to see that gingham look. Okay, so I've chained 2 and turned. I'm going to continue with my back loop only half double crochet slip stitches and just keep continuing with this all the way across, always chaining 2 and turning, making sure you always have 18 stitches in each row for the entirety of the pattern. And I'm just going to kind of leave you to it. You need to work up 3 strips each of the light and the dark sequins. And I always just have independent balls of yarn for the different blocks. So I have 2 separate ones for my blush block, and I have 2 separate ones for my mix block. Same thing when I do the lighter strips, I'll have 2 designated skeins for my mix, and then 2 skeins of cream that are separate for my solid block. So just keep continuing with this, work up all of the strips that you can. I have 6 strips total, again, 3 light, 3 dark. If you wanted to make this blanket larger, you could just add additional strips, but I will tell you, you will need to purchase extra yarn for that because your 4 balls of each color will not stretch you any larger than the throw size blanket. So here I've caught up with you after I've finished row 33. So here I am working that very last stitch. I've finished row 33. This is how it should be looking. I'm just going to go ahead and count my rows to make sure it's right. I've finished on the same side of the work as I did when I changed color the first time. Now I need to change back to my marled look because remember, I'll just alternate between these two. So I did leave that yarn attached when I changed color the first time. So that yarn is still attached. If you wanted to finish it off and weave the end, you can, but I'm going to carry it up just like this. So before I chain 2 and turn on row 33, I'm going to carry that yarn up the side. Make sure you're not pulling it really taut because then that'll cause a lot of problems later. You want to kind of leave the yarn slack and just yarn over and pull through to chain. And we're going to chain 2. So again, make sure you're not leaving that yarn too loose or pulling it too tight. It needs to just lie nicely on the side of your work without bunching or puckering anything. We're just going to turn and we're going to keep working along as we have been. Again, I'm going to leave those 2 strands of blush I just quit using. I'm just going to drop them and leave them there. This might cause some problems for you if you're taking your project on the go or you're moving your project around the room. If you're not sitting in one place and working on it undisturbed, you might run the risk of your yarn getting tangled, and in that situation I would recommend going ahead and finishing it off so you're not playing with 4 balls of yarn all attached to your project at once. But if you're sitting in one place like I am, you can probably get away with it without it tangling too much. So just go ahead and keep working. Carry up your yarn if you so choose, or go ahead and finish off and weave those ends. Work up all of your strips, and I'm going to catch back up with you to show you how to join them together. So after you have all 6 strips done, you should have something that looks like this. Here is one of my lighter colored strips. It is all done. I've weaved in all the ends except for where I carried that yarn, so you can see what a finished strip looks like. I've kept the exact same number of rows. I've just repeated and alternated my colors. I have 9 total blocks of color here in this strip, and it kind of looks like a scarf at this point. You can see where I've carried my yarn, and I'm going to hide those yarn carries when I weave this whole thing together. So I've already joined 5 of my strips together, and this is the last one. So here we can see what they kind of look like joined. We can see how the gingham is kind of coming through, and that those joins where I sewed it together are not terribly obvious. The yarn is pretty hidden, and you don't have these big ugly seams happening. So I'll show you exactly how I do that. And believe it or not, here where you see the strips sewn together, you don't see where that yarn was carried, and I sewed over it. So I'm going to show you exactly how to line all these things up, sew it up together, make it nice and a sturdy hold because we don't want all this work unraveling on us. And it's really quite simple. I'm just going to use a basic mattress stitch, and I'm going to hold together a strand of blush and a strand of cream, because no matter what two blocks you're sewing together, it's always going to line up where one of those blocks that's coming together next to each other, at least one of them is going to be your marled looking yarn. So that's why we're going to sew up this whole blanket with that marled blend of one strand cream, one strand blush, because no matter what part of it you're sewing, you're going to be sewing a marled piece to another piece. So also make sure that when you start sewing your pieces together, you're lining up both right sides facing up. And I'm going to start where both strands or both strips have the foundation chain at the top. So I'm going to start sewing together both strips with the foundation chain here at the top. So I have my tapestry needle, I have a strand of blush and a strand of cream, a nice long strand, like lots and lots of feet, so I don't have to weave in unnecessary ends. I've tied a knot at the bottom of my strand, and I'm going to start here in the foundation chain, not going down through the top. I'm always going to come up through the back side of the fabric for all of these stitches. So up and through that very first foundation chain stitch. Again, always coming from back of the fabric to the front. I'm going to pull that all the way through. Again, I cut a very, very, very long strand, like probably, I don't know, 6 feet long, just so I don't have to weave in more ends than I already have to. So now, instead of coming down through the top, we're going to come up through the bottom. So from the back of the fabric to the front, again, working through that first foundation chain stitch. So always back to front. This is a mattress stitch if you're familiar with mattress stitching. It's going to be fairly invisible. It's not going to be completely hidden, but it's not going to get in the way of your gingham look, and it's going to be very sturdy. So there's our first join stitch. Now, working into the first row, we're going to work around this loop right here on the edge. So we're going to go back to our marled side, the left side. We've come out the right side, and we can see here that the next thing we need to stitch into are these ribbed rows, and then we have those rows in between. So we have a rib row and a row in between, a rib row and a row in between, if you can see how that looks from your perspective here. So when we come back over to this pink side, we're going to be working from back to front once again, and we're just going to sew back and forth into rib rows and rows in between. So in this outside loop on the row in between, not a rib row, there's a little loop of yarn. There should be here on the marled one a pink and a white strand right here, and you're just going to come back to front through that loop on the very, very edge of this row of stitching. Now you're always going to sew into the same spot on your rows in between and your rib rows. Now your rows in between, you're always going to sew here through both strands of yarn. Remember how we held 2 strands together? Always in that last loop right on the edge. And then go ahead and pull that taut. Now going over to our cream side, this is also a row in between, not a rib row, and we should have again a little loop right there on the edge from that edge stitch. Now since our right sides are facing up, your stitches are going to look a little bit different from one block to the other when we're sewing together, but you should see a little loop right there on the edge that you can sew into, again, back to front, back of the fabric to the front of the fabric. So pull that taut. Now we're going to work into our rib rows. So these rows of little, what look like V's. On each side, there's going to be our last V before the end of the block. So we have all of these rows of what look like little V stitches, and we're just going to sew right up through the very middle of that V. So here's our last V of the row. We're going to sew up and through the very middle of the V-stitch, there should be a tiny little gap. We can see where that last V is right here. All of our rib rows are going to look like this on all of our strips. So from back to front, go through those 2 legs of the V. So back to front right here through the middle of that V-stitch. And pull your yarn all the way through. We're going to do exactly the same thing on the cream block here, but because our right sides are facing up, our V's are going to be facing kind of the other way. So you're going to again come from the back of the fabric to the front, and we're just going to go into that loop that's kind of behind the last V. So here you can see where that last V is right here. There's the center of that stitch, but I don't want to stitch in there because it's going to create a little bit of a more bulky seam because it's further from the very edge of our block. So I'm instead going to stitch into this little loop that's right behind the V itself. Hopefully you can see that here, right through that loop on the edge. And since we held 2 strands of yarn together for the entirety of this project, every time I say sew into a loop or into a loop of yarn, I'm talking about both strands that we held together. So again, going back to our marled side, we're working on a row in between now, not a rib row. We have our strand here, right on the edge, from the back of the fabric to the front. Pull that all the way through. There we go. On the right side, our cream side, again, this is a row in between. Don't jump down to the rib row. And go ahead and stitch right through that stitch on the end, that loop on the end. So now you're just going to keep repeating this all the way down. Make sure that you're going slowly and you're working into each row of stitching on both blocks. If this gets off at all and your rib rows aren't lining up, you will be off kilter when you get to the bottom of that block and your colors won't line up, and that'll completely throw off the entire gingham look. It'll start to look real messy. So make sure you just go slow during all this sewing, pay attention, and make sure your rib rows are always lining up. Again, here I am sewing into a rib row through both legs of the V, just right in the middle there of the legs of the V on the left side. On the right side, we're going to go into that loop right behind the last V. This should be fairly obvious even when you're sewing together. Your dark and light strips are on either sides and it doesn't look exactly like my video here does. The stitches should always make these same shapes, and it should be fairly easy to identify, especially once you start sewing together your first couple of strips. It'll get real easy, and just make sure you're paying attention to where you're stitching and that everything's lining up and your rows are nice and symmetrical. So go ahead and work all the way down the rest of this block exactly how you see. I'm going to catch up with you when we move on to the next blocks of color so that I can show you how we cover up those yarn strands that we carried up when we changed color. So at this point, I've worked down to the spot where we're going to join 2 strips where we're working over that carried yarn. Now you can skip this part if you did not carry your yarn and you just wove in all your ends as you went along. You can just skip on to the border area of the video. But if you did carry up your yarn, I'm going to show you how to kind of hide those yarn strands into your weaving. So we're going to sew exactly the same way that we have been up until this point. So exactly the same method as we have been doing. Sewing into the exact same spots, but what we're going to do to hide this tail is when we come to the side that has the carried yarn, so my right side is the one I'm working over, just when you insert your needle into the stitch, make sure that your needle is going behind that carried yarn and you're kind of catching it. So that carried yarn is on top of my needle and I'm working from back to front into the stitch and into the fabric itself. And go ahead and pull that taut. Now when we stitch up and over, Make sure your yarn is going up and over, and we're going to stitch into that fabric on the left from back to front. So you should be seeing this strand of yarn you're using to weave and to sew your pieces together. You should see it kind of coming up and around. You're going to work behind the strand to stitch into your next spot on the right side. And then I'm going to come up and over it to work into my stitches on the left side. It's a bit difficult to explain, but luckily we have the magic of video, and all of you visual learners like me can see exactly how you need to do it, even though I'm doing a horrible job of explaining exactly how to do this. Luckily we have video and you can watch me do it here. So hopefully this helps, and you can see here after I've done just a few stitches covering this carried yarn that it's completely masking it, and you really can't see that yarn that's being covered. So just go ahead and continue with this method, sew all the way down, and once you've sewed up all your strips, I'm going to catch back up with you and show you how I did the ribbed border. So here I have all my strips sewn up. I've weaved in all my ends from sewing. I can breathe a big sigh of relief and I can start the border. We are almost done. We just have 2 rows to do on this border. And then this blanket will be finished. I wanted to be sure to add a border just to make sure that things are nicely finished off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with, again, my marled kind of looking yarn. I'm going to hold together a cream and a blush strand. And you're just going to join your yarn to any corner of the blanket. Doesn't matter what corner. We're going to chain up 2. And now we're going to work just regular half double crochets into each stitch around. So plain old half double crochets. You can see here how that should be looking. I just worked right into the corner there for my first stitch. And now I'm going to work in each stitch along this whole side. So for me, I joined right where my foundation chains are all lining up from all of my strips. So I'm stitching here into the foundation chains themselves. But again, you can start in any corner and start with any side. It's going to be the same. So this is how it should be looking. Just again, go ahead and half double crochet all the way around. In each of those corner spots, I'm going to work 2 half double crochets except for where I very started. But you can see how this should be looking. Hopefully you can see that clearly. When you're working into the raw or rough edges of your blanket down those sides, just make sure you're working 1 half double crochet into each of the edges of those rows, and everything's nice and evenly spaced so you don't get any kind of ruffling with too many stitches or pulling and puckering with too few stitches. So just go ahead and half double crochet all the way around, and I'll catch up with you to show you row 2. So here I've finished just about row 1. I've gotten all the way back around to just about where I started. I'm going to half double crochet here in the last couple of stitches, always working into the edge of each row. It's nice and easy to be able to see along this rough edge here where your rib rows are and your rows in between are when the right side is facing you. So you can just kind of work into each of those ends of the rows. I'm going to slip stitch to join here to my very beginning chain 2, and if you want to stop here or you're running out of yarn because your tension's a little different from mine, that's totally fine, but I'm going to add an additional row of our back loop only half double crochet slip stitch to kind of add a nice little edge ribbing around the edges here. So I've chained up 2, and in each stitch all the way around I'm going to work the same stitch I did for the body of the blanket in the back loop only. Yarn over, insert your hook, pull up a loop, and pull through 2. So you should be very, very familiar with this stitch at this point. You've worked it probably a few thousand times. And you're just going to work that same stitch in each stitch all the way around, and it's just going to kind of push forward these nice little V stitches and create a nice little kind of rib looking edging here. So you can see how this should be looking. You see those little V stitches pushing forward. Again, just back loop only, half double crochet slip stitch. Same thing we've been doing, except now we're just going around the outside instead of back and forth. Now, this time around, I'm not going to make any multiple stitches in the corners. I'm just going to work 1 back loop only, half double crochet slip stitch in each stitch all the way around. Don't do anything fancy in the corners, and I'm just going to slip stitch to join when I'm done. So just go ahead and work all the way around, and you can see here how my edging is looking. If you wanted to add any fun tassels to the corners of your blankets or pom-poms, that would be a really nice accent. You might have enough spare yarn in your bonus bundles to accommodate that, but for me it was cutting it pretty close with having all of my ends and all of the yarn you need for the sewing of all of those panels. So accents are great, but I'm not sure if you're going to have enough yarn for it. And you can see here how that ribbing is looking, how this edging is looking. It just really finishes it off nicely, but you could always just stick with that one row of half double crochet all the way around, and that looks really nice too. I just love that knit looking rib stitch. It's so fun. I did want to catch up with you here at the end. I've worked all the way around. I've gotten back to where I started. I'm going to work in this very last stitch. Make sure you don't miss any, and then I'm going to slip stitch into that chain 2 from where I started the round. So go ahead and slip stitch that in. And it's a pretty seamless join. You can't really see once you finish and you weave in the ends where you started or ended with this finishing touch on the edging. Now I just need to weave these ends and my blanket is completely done. It's very sturdily assembled and it's just beautiful. It's such a statement piece for the home, and I can't wait to see all of your gingham blankets that you make. So make sure to tag me on social media at Sorella. Also make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thank you guys so much for watching this video and all of my other crochet tutorials over on my main channel page. Thanks so much.